Hello, my name is Didac Llorens, and what we are going to do today is follow the worksheet that was uploaded to the online course a couple of weeks ago. This, as you know, was a worksheet to work on a fragment from a poem containing a number of guidelines. I will be following this PowerPoint that you can see here now, and covering most of the aspects contained in that worksheet, which, as I said earlier, you can find on the online course. The first two sections of that worksheet are intended to work for any poetic text, or at least for a very wide range of poetic texts. And as some of you have noted, they are not necessarily coherent with the theory or the tenets of post-structuralism, which we are focusing on in Unit 1. It is only in the third section of that document where you are required to have these tenets of post-structuralism in mind. Okay, so I will now begin with the first section, that is the context. You had a number of questions, and thinking of the answers to those questions in mind, you are expected to write a short paragraph, a short discursive paragraph contextualizing the fragment. So it was probably obvious to most of you that the fragment belonged to a poem by Dylan Thomas called A Refusal to Mourn the Death by Fire of a Child in London. The fragment comprises the first two stanzas of the poem and the first line of the third, which closes a sentence. The whole poem is made up of 4 stanzas. This poem was published in 1945, first 1945 in a journal, a year later in belonging to a collection of poems. So 1945, towards the end of World War II, which, as you know, began in 1939 and finished in 1945. Apparently what moved Dylan Thomas to write the poem was learning about a little girl who died as a result of a fire during the Blitz in London. The Blitz refers to the German bombing of several British cities in 1940 and 1941. We can conclude, therefore, or we can assume that the poem must have been composed or at least planned about 5 years before its publication in 1945, as I said. Let's consider the title of the poem. The title, we could say, is the declaration of an intention, apparently descriptive, so the title of the poem appears to announce what the poem or what the poet is going to do. And I would like to stress apparently here, because this is a very important aspect of the poem which has been discussed in the forums and to which I will come back later. So, a title which is a declaration of an intention, apparently descriptive, unusually long perhaps, and then also a striking thing is the fact that the phrase "by fire" appears between commas, which seems to set this phrase apart and somehow to draw attention to it, suggesting perhaps and stressing the fact that this is a sacrificial death. One of the questions in this section, the context section, asked you to take into account the nationality of the poem. Although Thomas is very much thought of as a Welsh poet, this is not very relevant in relation to the fragment, although his hometown, Swansea in Wales, was also bombed during the Blitz. Thomas, however, was also associated with London, which is the setting of the poem we are considering, and he lived in London, where his career as a poet was beginning. So, as I said, he was a Welsh poet from Swansea, but also associated with London. And finally, I'll just mention the literary context of the poem and of Thomas's work, which developed in the context of modernism, which is a literary movement that developed during the first half of the 20th century. Even though Thomas is not one of the key modernist poets, or perhaps not one of the most representative, we could set his work in the context of modernism. Modernism, which is characterized by formal experimentation, and some of the aspects of the poem that we will be considering could be viewed as examples of this formal experimentation. And looking at modernism from a historical perspective, we could also say that this is the movement that most directly reflected the effects of the two great wars, of the World War I and World War II. So, taking all this into account, as I said at the beginning, you could write a short introductory paragraph. I will now move on to the second section of your analysis, which is probably the most important, or the one that requires more attention, and this is form content. I will be covering several aspects. The first one is the genre. The genre meaning the type of text this is. What type of text are we looking at? And to begin with these comments on genre, I would like to refer to a part of the poem which is not on your worksheet, but which is important. Towards the end of the third stanza, which is not reproduced in your worksheet, as I just said, the voice in the poem expresses a refusal to write, and I quote, an elegy of innocence and youth. So perhaps we could begin by looking at a definition of elegy. This is a definition I have taken from Chris Baldick's The Oxford Dictionary of Literary Terms, which is a very accessible dictionary, not very expensive. Many libraries have it, and then you can also access part of it through Google Books. There is also a glossary as part of the online course, and also a PDF document with definitions and examples of relevant terms. So, what is an elegy? An elaborately lyric formal poem lamenting the death of a friend or public figure, or reflecting seriously on a solemn subject. So, I have highlighted the word lyric in this definition, and that will take us to another definition. That is the definition of lyric or lyrical poetry, also from Baldick. The most extensive category of verse by comparison to narrative and dramatic poetry. So we have lyric poetry as opposed to narrative poetry and dramatic poetry. Poetry that tells a story, and dramatic poetry as used by Shakespeare, for instance. Poetry used in dialogues to present character or to make a plot advance. The second part of this definition says that the most usual emotions presented are those of love and grief. And grief, of course, would be the feeling expressed by elegies. So, the sequence we would be following to define the genre of this fragment would be poetry, lyrical poetry or lyric poetry, and then the elegy. We could say that the fragment or the whole poem is lyrical. We have first person expressing feelings, and that more or less defines lyrical poetry. The question of whether this poem is an elegy is more problematic, because it begins denying itself as an elegy. It begins as a refusal to mourn, and this is clear in the title and in the first two stanzas, but then the poem ends up becoming an elegy. Okay, the second aspect to consider as part of your form content analysis, the lyrical speaker. So in lyrical poetry we tend to identify the lyrical speaker with the poet in the same way as we tend to identify an external narrator with a real author in fiction. Now, we should be careful not to do this when we analyze a text. It is better not to assume that this identification between poet and lyrical voice always works. So we would strongly encourage you to use the terms lyrical speaker, voice, persona, rather than the poet or Thomas in this case. So please don't always identify poet with lyrical speaker unless this is very clear in examples of confessional poetry, for instance, and use these terms instead: lyrical speaker, poetic speaker, voice, persona, poetic eye sometimes as well. So the person who speaks in a poem as opposed to the poet himself or herself. So if I don't give you a source for this definition, this means that these are definitions from the glossary of the online course, or that these are definitions that I have written myself. So why use these terms? Well, as I said, to establish a distinction between the real person, the real author, and the voice that we hear in the poem. The worksheet also suggested that you could consider the speaker's ideology. This is difficult when you have just a fragment, so unless the ideology is very relevant, I would just leave it out of your analysis. However, about this particular fragment, we could say that the views expressed are those of a pacifist. War is not glorified. On the contrary, it is not viewed in patriotic terms. Okay. Next, the next aspect, or a number of aspects I have put together: imagery, poetic devices, figures of speech. And we could begin with another definition. This is a definition of imagery, which is a very relevant term when we analyze poetry. So what is imagery? The use of language to represent objects, actions, feelings, thoughts, ideas, states of mind, and any sensory or extrasensory experience. As you can see, a mixture of concrete and abstract things. Visual images dominate in this fragment from Thomas' poem. In the first stanza, for instance, bird, beast, and flower could be considered to represent various forms of life, and we are also presented with a binary opposition light-darkness, to which I will refer again later when we focus on post-structuralism, because, as many of you know, the study of binary oppositions is a key aspect of post-structuralism. Images are often combined in metaphors. In a sense, we could say that images are the raw material of metaphors. And I'm going to give you a very simple definition of metaphor. Metaphor is a very complex phenomenon, but we're going to make it very simple for the purposes of this class. So, we could define metaphor as the identification of images with other images or with concepts based on a relationship of similarity. And I'm going to look at two examples from the first stanza of the poem. For instance, the use of the verb to father here in bird, beast, and flower fathering involves both metaphor and personification. Personification, as most of you will know, consists in giving human attributes to animals or things. And it is often based on a metaphorical association. So you can see here inside that arrow on the left, you can see a statement or a sentence in bold, and it says, creating is becoming the father of a child. So this is how we normally sum up or express what a metaphor consists in with a sentence using the verb to be, a subject, the verb to be, and a subject complement. So, creating is becoming the father of a child. That would be the first metaphor and also an instance of personification. It would also be worth noting that this is an essentially masculine metaphor. The poet says father and not mother, not engender. And it would perhaps be a good idea to contrast the use of the verb father here with the figure of the mother that is mentioned in the last stanza of the poem. But this is outside our scope today. I would also like to consider the phrase, the sea tumbling in harness, at the end of the first stanza, which you can see here. Now, a harness is put on a horse, as you know, to keep it under control. So the sea is being implicitly compared to a horse. There is tension in the image or metaphor because even though the sea is harnessed, it is tumbling. That is, it is moving continuously and violently. We could also identify a source of ambiguity which you could pursue. What if tumbling in harness refers to the still hour and not to the sea? So that phrase, tumbling in harness, could be considered to modify the still hour and not the sea, and in that case your reading of this stanza would be slightly different. I'll just mention this and I will come back to it later. let's move on to the second stanza, and we have several things to look at here. The first metaphor is the round Zion of the water bead. Zion, as some of you will know, is synonymous with Jerusalem, the holy city, synonymous with the temple for the Israelites. This is compared to a water bead, and this is there is in fact a metaphor within a metaphor here, because a drop of water is compared to a water bead, and a bead is round and small. This is what we would say in Spanish, una cuenta, a bead in a rosary, for instance. So a metaphor inside another metaphor, as I said, water bead, water drop compared to a water bead, and water bead compared or equated with the city of Zion. Water bead, a very small quantity of water, contrasts with the image of the huge sea in the preceding stanza. The water bead is round, but the adjective is applied to Zion, not to water bead. So we don't have I must enter again the Zion of the round water bead, but the round Zion of the water bead, and the effect is that the identification of the two terms of the metaphor is strengthened. The other metaphor is the synagogue of the ear of corn. Again, ear is a metaphor, but I won't go into that because I don't want to complicate things very much. But the ear of corn is identified with a synagogue, a building for Jewish worship. Both these metaphors, the round Zion of the water bead and the synagogue of the ear of corn, have Judeo-Christian, biblical, specifically Old Testament connotations. They also suggest peaceful and protective spaces. The third phrase I would like to comment on is the shadow of a sound. This would be an example of synesthesia, which some of you may be familiar with. Synesthesia consists on the evocation of one sense in terms of another. In this case, evocation of sound in terms of sight. The shadow of a sound implies that sound is an object that can project a shadow, and as I said, this would be an example of sound being evoked or imagined in terms of sight as an object. And the last thing from this second stanza would be a very brief comment on the phrase "the least valley of sackcloth." We have another metaphor here: the ground, the land, which is waste, barren and dry, is compared to a coarse fabric, to sackcloth. So again, you have a sentence with "to be" there. The ground is sackcloth, and this phrase, and also "sow my salt seed," which is not a metaphor, but together with the least valley of sackcloth, also echo biblical phrases like the vale or valley of tears from Psalm 84, or the salt of the earth from the Gospel of Matthew, which have become idiomatic in English. So again, more biblical echoes in this second stanza. Okay. We now move on to a different aspect, versification. The poem is structured in 6 line stanzas, rhyming ABC, ABC, So as you can see very easily, making rhymes with breaking, flower rhymes with hour, darkness rhymes with harness. So ABC, ABC, a very clear rhyme. The length of the lines varies from 5 syllables in bird, beast and flower to 11, that would be the longest line, the majesty and burning of the child's death. The number of stresses is largely consistent. Short lines have 3 stresses and longer lines have 4. I would strongly encourage you to listen to Thomas's reading of his own poem if you haven't listened to it yet, among other reasons because it helps very much in locating the stresses. The words that bear the stress are typically nouns, verbs and adjectives. And I would like to refer you to a thread in the online course in the Foro de Consultas Generales. This was especially to a message sent by my colleague Jesus Cora. The thread is called Analyzing English Poetry, and you will find more information about versification there, very useful information on versification patterns. A key element of this fragment and of the poem itself is alliteration. This is again a definition from Chris Baldick's Oxford Dictionary of Literary Terms. So what does alliteration consist in? What is alliteration? The repetition of the same sounds, usually initial consonants of words or of stressed syllables, in any sequence of neighboring words. So any sequence of neighboring words, if we are analyzing poetry, this is of course a verse line. So the repetition of the same sounds in a line of poetry. Alliteration is an important device with a very long tradition in English poetry, and its main function is to mark or stress the rhythm rather than suggesting sound effects or suggesting a symbolism as it is sometimes used in Romance languages. Examples of alliteration in these two stanzas would be mankind making, bird, beast, last light, sow my souled seed. Okay? Right. So let's now move on to the syntax. So unusually, a single sentence covers the first two stanzas and the first line of the third. The first 9 verse lines of the fragment and of the poem make up a syntactically very complex time adjunct. So a time adjunct is what we would call, or at least this is how it was called when I was at school, un complemento circunstancial de tiempo, a time adjunct, preceding the main verb and clause, which comes in the 10th line. So the main clause begins with shall I let pray on the 10th line of the poem. And the preceding lines are, as I have just said, a time adjunct, a very complex one. Another key concept here, a key literary term, would be enjambment, which obviously comes from the French word for leg, and it refers to the practice of continuing a phrase or sentence beyond a verse line or stanza. Enjambment is consistently used in the poem by Dylan Thomas. In the examples we are going to look at, syntactic units are split into two verse lines. This would be the case, for instance, with the round Zion. That straight bar there signals the end of a verse line and the beginning of another, and this is quite unusual for such a short noun phrase to be split into two verse lines. Other times objects do not immediately follow their verbs, and they appear in the next line, even in the next stanza. And this would be the case with the second example here, to mourn, and here the line is suspended and we have to wait until the next stanza to find out what should be mourned. So to mourn the majesty and burning of the child's death. So the effect, I think, is it is a very effective use of enjambment to suspend the object of that verb and defer it to the next stanza. Other aspects of syntax which are worth mentioning, maybe the use of gerunds. Gerunds abound in the first stanza. You have making, breaking, tumbling, humbling as well, although humbling is used as an adjective. But all these gerunds suggest actions in progress. And then the recurrence of the conjunction and. Since this is a sentence, it's a very long and additive sentence, and the conjunction and appears 6 times in only 13 lines. Okay, and to conclude the second section of your analysis, the form content section, I would like to look at themes and the interrelation between form and content. Themes, as we indicated in the worksheet, should be formulated in abstract terms. In a noun phrase, preferably in no more than 10 words. In this case, in the case of the poem by Dylan Thomas, it is particularly difficult to define the theme because of the poetic speaker's ambivalent attitude, not wanting to do something and doing it in the end. However, the themes of the fragment could be phrased as follows, and this is a bit subjective, and of course it could be questioned, other themes could be added, but I would choose or suggest as the main themes these two: the anticipation of apocalypse and the deferral of an intention. Specifically about these two stanzas, about this fragment, and not about the whole poem. And finally, how do form and content interrelate in this quote from the poem? So the poem's rhythm and syntax, we could argue, recall the solemn, insistent, even hammering style of a preacher, of a sermon maybe, and the biblical quality of several images has already been mentioned and examined. It could also be argued that the fragment's form reflects the speaker's confusion and shock, expressing the contradiction between intending not to do something and in the first half of the poem and ending up doing it in the second half of the poem, which is out of our analysis today. Okay, and again, with all this information, you would be expected to write, the worksheet said no more than 500 words, but let me insist that we are looking for discursive paragraphs, not just notes, and you would be expected to organize all this information in a coherent and cohesive way, to write about 3, maybe 4 paragraphs covering all these aspects, or the aspects that you consider most important. Okay, so the third section, it says 2 here, but it should be 3, sorry about that. So the third section of our analysis, in which we will be looking at theory and criticism. So the first thing I should say perhaps is that you were not expected to produce a deconstructive reading or analysis of this fragment, but rather to go through the aspects you would be looking at if you were asked to do so. So perhaps we could begin with some ideas we have been discussing in the forums and on which I have been insisting very much. The first one has to do with the figure of the author. So post-structuralism denies the author the maximum authority as the source of the text. So the author and his or her supposed intentions, which we can only conjecture very often, are not the key to interpreting the poem. So you should avoid referring to these intentions or trying to guess them, to ascertain what these intentions are. So I'm beginning with things you should not do. So do not consider biographical circumstances, do not explain the supposed intentions of the author. Then post-structuralism aims at exposing disunity in a text, and this is a key word, disunity. So a structuralist reading of the poem would be looking for unity and coherence, patterns within the text, and post-structuralism aims at doing the opposite, at making the text explode, as it were, in a variety of meanings, looking for and focusing on disunity in the text. You should also avoid, therefore, analyzing the text's elements with a view to making them cohere into a fixed meaning or interpretation. We are not looking for a fixed meaning, but rather the opposite. We are aiming at dissolving meaning, deconstructing it. So I would be loosely following Barrett's system, Barrett's method, which, as you know, is made up of 3 phases or stages. The first one is the verbal stage, in which we should be looking at contradictions and paradoxes, for instance. And here you have a definition of paradox. This is from a different source, from Cubedo, the Penguin Dictionary of Literary Terms, which defines paradox as an apparently self-contradictory, even absurd statement which, on closer inspection, and this is the important bit, is found to contain a truth reconciling the conflicting opposites. So, if we are not able to do that, to identify an underlying truth to these opposites, perhaps we should simply talk about contradiction and not paradox. An example of contradiction, and maybe not paradox, would be the juxtaposition of never and until at the very beginning of the poem. Why is this a contradiction? Because it implies the negation that something will happen, never, and the suggestion that it will happen at a given moment, until. If you remember, I talked earlier about the possible ambivalence and the possibility that the phrase tumbling in harness could refer to the still hour rather than the sea. If we read the first stanza in this way, we could also identify a contradiction implicit in the use of still and tumbling in the same clause, suggesting both lack of movement, still, and movement, and violent continuous movement, which is suggested by the verb to tumble. There could also be a contradiction, or at least incongruence, in the use of certain images, as in the last line of your quotation, the majesty and burning. Quite conflicting images here, although perhaps we could come up with a way to explain them, but since this is a post-structuralist approach, we could be happy with just identifying the conflict here. The clearest example of paradox perhaps is in the phrase tells with silence. In principle, telling something is the opposite of remaining silent, but silence, and here is the paradox, silence has communicative force. It can be meaningful, it can be telling. So, an interesting paradox here. Also, as part of Barry's verbal stage, we should consider binary oppositions, and also the way in which they are neutralized or reversed. I will give you a definition of binary opposition. This is from the glossary of the online course, and it says it defines binary opposition as the principle of contrast between two mutually exclusive terms. Each term is dependent on the other to constitute itself. Now, post-structuralist analysis is particularly alert, as I was saying, to the reversal of binary oppositions, so that the conventionally secondary or negative term is set into relief. It becomes the most important. In the poem, this is the case with the binary opposition light-darkness, since the darkness takes the foreground. It is highlighted as a momentous circumstance, a circumstance that will bring a great realization, a moment of supreme awareness. Another interesting binary opposition, which is not in these two stanzas but in the final stanza of the poem, would be the binary opposition between life and death, which we have talked about in the forums as well. Moving on to Barry's textual stage, we should look for discontinuities in the text. This is expressed here. Look for discontinuities. For example, in the poem, the contrast between the very impersonal first stanza and the use of the first person pronoun I in the second. In a sense, we could argue that there is a gradation, that the poem evolves from less to more, from more to less impersonality, from the first stanza to the fourth. Barry also mentions omissions as a relevant thing to look at when approaching a text from a post-structuralist perspective, when deconstructing a text. And probably the most important omission here is that the speaker tells us in a very elaborate way that he refuses to mourn, but he does not explain why. He omits the reason why he refuses to mourn. And then the third stage of Barry's method, the linguistic stage, would require to look at the whole poem. I will only mention here that the speaker ends up doing what he has just declared he would not do. The contradiction, in other words, the contradiction between intention and performance. Barry's linguistic stage, as I said, takes the whole text into account, and this would be a kind of paradox involving the whole text, which you could simply mention, since you are asked only to look at the first two stanzas, but you could hint at this in your conclusion. Okay, so that's all. I would refer you to Barry's beginning theory, especially to pages 71 and 74, which focus on the poem by Dylan Thomas. Read also, if you haven't done so yet, the various threads in the Unit 1 forum. We have talked a lot on this poem, so I would recommend that that you go through all these messages in preparation for the exam and for the PEG. And that's all. I hope you find this video class useful. If you have any doubts or ideas about this, the Unit 1 forum will be closed very soon, but it will open another forum before the exam. And if you have any doubts, you can contact me by email. We will be uploading other video classes on various poems, the set readings, also on aspects of literary theory, and we hope you find these useful. Let me finish by encouraging you with your work, and also thanking you for your patience, because this unit has been very dense, very theoretical, and as you can see, we'll be looking at other aspects to look at texts in other units. Thank you very much. Thank you.